Everyone. My name is Hadar Harris, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law here at American University Washington College of Law. I would like to welcome you and thank you all for coming to what apparently is an even more timely event than we had anticipated, given the fact that things are literally changing moment by moment in Egypt at this second. We actually have somebody monitoring the internet to give us up-to-the-moment updates. But we are grateful and thankful that we have many people in the room today, and we know many of you watching by webcast as we talk about the events going on in Egypt, in Tunisia, across the Middle East and North Africa, and the human rights implications of these changes that are taking place. At the outset, I'd like to thank Matias Hernandez, the Assistant Director of the Center for Human Rights, and Maria Lakshin for their support and all of their help in putting together today's events. And also just want to mention a couple of upcoming events that we'll be having next Wednesday, February 16th at 12 p.m. in the student lounges. We'll be having a conversation with the Center's co-directors about what it is to do human rights work as a practitioner. Dean Claudio Grossman, the Dean of the Law School, is also the chair of the UN Committee Against Torture. Professor Juan Mendez, who's a visiting member of our faculty, is currently the UN Special Rapporteur on torture. Both of them and Professor Bob Goldman all served on the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Professor Bob Goldman was the first UN independent expert on human rights and terrorism. In addition, Professor Rick Wilson, who defends Guantanamo detainees and also has been quite active in efforts to overturn the death penalty in the United States, will be speaking, as will Professor Herman Schwartz, who's a worldwide expert on constitutional drafting and reform. So we encourage you to join us to talk with them in conversation about the actual practice of doing human rights work next Wednesday at noon. On Thursday, we'll be joined by Rebecca Harrison, who is the special correspondent on Sudan for the Washington Post, to talk about a book that she's just published about fighting for Darfur and the struggle for advocacy, which will be taking place again at noon on Thursday, February 17th in room 401. So with that put aside, we turn to today's events and the events that have been taking place most markedly since December 17th, but certainly brewing for many, many years before that. As I think many of us know, on December 17th, a 26-year-old university graduate from Tunisia named Mohamed Bouazizi was selling vegetables when he couldn't find work, despite the fact that he had a university degree. And he, very frustrated, set himself on fire after the police confiscated his unlicensed vegetable cart. This act caused a spontaneous, or maybe not so spontaneous, outpouring of public anger in Tunisia over economic conditions and the ruling family's very endemic corruption. A little more than 3 weeks later, the longtime dictator, President Ben Ali, fled the country to take refuge in Saudi Arabia. Inspired by that public and people-oriented action to oust the Tunisian president, people around the Middle East and North Africa have taken similar actions to protest the oppression of their governments and to demand their fundamental human rights. Yet the acts of peaceful protest in many places have been met by repression in other parts of the region. Human Rights Watch has recently documented that the governments in the Arab world, including in Saudi Arabia, in Sudan, in Syria, the United Arab Emirates, the West Bank, and Yemen, have violently dispersed demonstrations that were apparently inspired by or held in solidarity with what's happened in Tunisia and what is going on today in Egypt. This, despite the fact that almost all of these countries have signed international agreements protecting the right to assembly and the right to free expression. Today, we're at what could be seen as an almost unbelievable turning point. Following on the popular ouster of President Ben Ali, the people of Egypt are either waiting for or in the middle of an address from President Hosni Mubarak in which it's largely expected that he will announce his resignation. As we know, since January 25th, tens of thousands of Egyptians have come together at this extraordinary moment. Despite the formidable presence of police, having limited exposure over this 30 years of the Mubarak presidency to dissenting voices because of state-controlled media, and understanding the very likely risk of violent repercussions for voicing their grievances, the people of Egypt have stood in largely peaceful protest. The initial scenes of protests that we have seen through the media, on the internet, on television, and heard about on radio have shown us that people of all ages, of all religions, of all backgrounds, all political affiliations have taken to the streets. But the protests that have taken place have also been met by counter protests and reactions from largely thought to be paid government activists who burst through those protests and who violently have attacked protesters, targeting, as we know, foreign journalists as well as human rights defenders. Human Rights Watch, again, recently reported that to date over 300 people have died in the protests in Egypt and many, many more have been detained. So today, the protests in Tunisia and in Egypt, triggered by economic demands, have evolved into movements that are opposing government corruption and repression and making demands for fundamental human rights. And yet, as we witness the change in Tunisia, and we're about to witness the regime change in Egypt, the question of what happens to human rights becomes even more acute. Just last night, the newly appointed Vice President Suleiman in Egypt, who is no great friend to human rights, as he was the point person for the CIA's rendition program in Egypt and a former interior minister, told Egyptian newspapers that there could be a coup unless demonstrators agreed to enter negotiations. A warning that may have actually taken place today. In that interview, he further suggested that Egypt wasn't ready for democracy and that a government-formed panel of judges dominated by Mubarak loyalists would push ahead with recommending its own constitutional amendments to be put to a referendum. The movement of the people after 30 years of repression in Egypt is a hopeful one and an inspiring sign. But the ouster of Mubarak, as the ouster of President Ben Ali, certainly don't solve the issues of fundamental human rights, and one wonders if the door has not been opened for an even more repressive crackdown in the days that follow. Today we have three experts with us who will talk about this ever-changing situation in the region. We're joined here in the room by Jacques Duval, who's the president and founding director of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. He was the executive producer of the two-part Emmy-nominated PBS series A Force More Powerful and co-authored the companion book of the same name. He is an expert in nonviolent conflict, in nonviolent people-powered movements, and we are really privileged to have you here today, Jack. In addition, we have T. Kumar, who is the Director of International Advocacy for Amnesty International USA. He's worked in a variety of Asian and African countries, served as a human rights monitor in many Asian countries, as well as in Bosnia, Afghanistan, Guatemala, and South Africa, and has also served as director of several refugee camps. He has testified before the U.S. Senate, the House of Representatives, and frequently lectures around the country. And so we are privileged as well to have you with us. Finally, we hope momentarily to be joined on the telephone by Joe Stork from Cairo, who is the Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa Division. He is certainly an expert on human rights in the region and has been in Cairo for the last several weeks. And he will be joining us, but is currently in the midst of a security meeting. And so apologizes for joining us a little bit late, but he will have up-to-the-moment updates from the ground there. So to start our conversation, I'd like to ask Jacques Duval to come and give us a little overview of how you see what is happening in Egypt, in Tunisia, and throughout the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Hadar. It's really a privilege to be here at a very timely moment in the unfoldment of events in the Middle East and today in Egypt. As Hadar said, my field of study and action has to do with the use of civil resistance, nonviolent resistance, to oppressive power in all of its manifestations around the world. My organization is an educational foundation that makes accessible to everyone who is interested in the subject, whether scholars or activists, the knowledge of how civil resistance works. We've seen that, those of us who have been following events in Egypt particularly in the last 2 weeks, unfold in an extraordinarily rapid fashion right before our eyes. I'd like to offer you, if I can, a bit of a précis in a holistic sense of what this process is like, which can take years to unfold in most of the nonviolent transitions to new governments that observe rights and democracy that have taken place over the course of the last 50 to 100 years. We're all familiar with the great people power movements that impelled substantial change and democratic transition in countries like Poland and South Africa, Eastern Europe in 1989, and countries not as well known such as Mali and the Maldives, the so-called color revolutions in Serbia and Ukraine. And there have been others, and they're brewing in many places around the world today. The core dynamic of all of these changes that have been triggered by action of ordinary people coming together in campaigns and movements is simply this. It's the use of a large variety of civilian-based actions, protests, strikes, boycotts, and civil disobedience to disrupt the operations of an authoritarian or rights-denying system. This concept of disruption is terribly important. Withdrawing cooperation from the state, placing various kinds of pressures on the state that do not endanger lives, but do endanger the profitable and smooth operation of an autocratic system, which reduces its legitimacy in the eyes of not yet mobilized people, as well as in the eyes of the world community, and raises the cost of maintaining the system. At the 11th hour in many of these struggles, the military of the country, or key units or key officers at a senior level of militaries in these countries, have shifted, have changed sides essentially. Why have they done that? Not necessarily because they've had a sudden conversion to the values of the movement that they've seen unfolding. In most cases, it's been because they've seen the handwriting on the wall. They recognize that the regime has lost the cooperation and the acquiescence of the people, has visibly lost its fear even in the face of various levels of oppression, and that a change is likely. And then they have to ask themselves the question, am I going to survive this change? And where then does my loyalty really rest? That was a key factor in the change in the Philippines. It was a key factor in the change in Ukraine and in others of these struggles. And it seems to be manifest to us today in Egypt. And I'll touch on Tunisia, but let me shift this core dynamic, if I might, into the circumstances of Egypt. We know that in Egypt there has been substantial discontent coming from diverse sources within the country for a long period of time. 3 years ago, my organization did a seminar at the Ibn Khaldun Center in Cairo on the use of nonviolent resistance as a way to challenge authority. In the room where we gave this, there were about 50 people, and they consisted of human rights lawyers, activists, students, Bedouins, Islamists, people of all descriptions who had a variety of grievances with the Egyptian government. And they were very interested in learning how they could organize themselves and, if the moment arose, mobilize themselves to engage in resistance against what they saw as a government which was in some way denying them rights, advancement, justice, a fair share of the benefits of living in Egyptian society, and progress for the country as a whole. Represented also in that room was the idea of representation. They were coming together representing a broad variety of constituencies, which you've seen in the last 2 weeks in Tahrir Square. They were interested in organizing, and there was organizing going forward. As we know, activists who've been interviewed from Tahrir Square by a variety of journalists and news services, Al Jazeera, the BBC, The Guardian, many other news outlets, have represented the people who are active in the Kafaya organization, in the April 6th organization, and in other organizations that have been active on the ground in Cairo. We know that the opportunity to do something, to express discontent, was furnished by the events in Tunisia, which alerted those who had always wanted to mobilize broader numbers of Egyptians behind some movement for change to the opportunity to do that if some sort of protest was organized. The size of the protest that self-aggregated very quickly was surprising, I think, to participants as well as to the outside world, and is a reflection in part of the inchoate discontent in Egyptian society and the sense that perhaps the historical moment had arrived by virtue of what had happened in Tunisia and what was happening throughout the region. What has happened, however, uniquely in my judgment with respect to the events in Egypt, as I look at many of these other historical uses of civil resistance, is a sense, a form of national or representative mobilization right before our very eyes. Usually these mass protests happen later in the maturation of a movement, but here you have a movement actually coalescing in a sense right before our eyes in what is effectively protected civic space, which the army has furnished by virtue of its desire to continue to claim its position of legitimacy and its reputation in the eyes of the people. Had there been early repression, and had the army participated in that repression, massive repression, not the third force repression we saw a couple of days last week, then the army couldn't have held on to that image within Egyptian society, which long predates, by the way, the Mubarak regime. And that's provided something that we haven't seen, that I don't recall seeing before, in the rise and the expression of civil resistance, which is a kind of regime tolerated space in which we see organizing and mobilizing happening right before our very eyes. The tenor and the psychology of that in view, that televised mobilization, if you will, I think is well represented by two remarks of two participants in it. In Tom Friedman's column a couple of days ago, Speaker's Corner on the Nile, he quotes a 50-year-old engineer who has spontaneously joined this movement, and yet this man's statement could have been taken out of a half a dozen different movements in the last couple of decades. He said, Hossam Khalaf, "We got a message from Tunis, and the message was, don't burn yourself up. Burn up the fear that is inside you." He quickly understood that repression worked to inhibit a full expression of popular discontent taking active form, and that the initial step that had to be taken was to lose fear. The massive numbers in that square helped to facilitate that process. And then from an article in The Guardian last week, this extraordinary quote from another spontaneous participant in the events, a 35-year-old teacher who had joined the protest in Tahrir Square, Ahmed Mahmoud, who said this about what was happening last week within Tahrir. He said, "People have changed. They were scared. They are no longer scared. We are not afraid of his system any longer, and when we stopped being afraid, we knew we would win. We will not again allow ourselves to be scared of a government. A government. We will not be afraid to say when we think the president is wrong or the government is bad. This is the revolution in our country. The revolution in our minds. Mubarak can stay for days or weeks, but he cannot change that." This remark had the mark of the sense of certitude that there was going to be a decisive change that you see in the remarks of people who participate in these uses of civil resistance just before they, in fact, are broadly successful. And that's why I began to believe, along with those in Tahrir Square last week, having seen many of these uses of civil resistance historically, both those I'd studied in the past as well as those I've observed firsthand for the last 13 to 14 years, go awry for one reason or another, because there was effective repression, but also for a variety of other reasons. The movement didn't know how to negotiate, didn't know how to accept concessions and build further space for the future. That's what happened to a certain extent in Tiananmen. It's happened in a number of other countries. There are mistakes that one can make when conducting and managing and developing strategy and doing the action of a civil resistance movement. But there also are remarkable, not necessarily spontaneous, but sometimes intuitively brilliant uses of resistance, together with a growing movement that acquires legitimacy because of its form, because of its shape, because of its discourse, because it appeals to the imagination of people who didn't even know they were going to join a movement until they joined a movement. And the events that have happened in Egypt are, in a sense, a fast forwarding of this process, partly by virtue of the world spotlight on it, partly of the virtue of what I call the unique spontaneous space that was protected, and at least to this hour remains protected in Tahrir Square and elsewhere in Alexandria and in other locations around Egypt.
Thank you. I'd like to now ask T. Kumar. I apologize for checking my BlackBerry. We're waiting for word from Joe as soon as he can catch it. Please.
Thank you very much, Heather, for inviting us to participate in this timely and important event. The reason why it's important is it sends a message not only to the neighboring Arab countries about rising up against political oppression, it also sends a message around the world to people who may be living and who are living in certain countries where one-party rule or the military regimes are there suppressing the rights of individuals as well as the communities. Today the situation in Egypt is moving, as Ada mentioned. The topic is ideal, crisis to opportunity when it comes to human rights protection. Crisis came partly because of massive human rights abuses that were committed by these governments against its own citizens. When you take Egypt as an example, for the last 30 years, it is one person under his military rule committed massive human rights abuses. Tens of thousands of people were imprisoned without charge or trial. People were tortured. People were killed. No freedom of expression was given. No meaningful political party was allowed to operate. Everything was controlled. It was a police state, pretty much enforced by the military might of that government. It went on for 30 years. No one ever dreamt. Most importantly, no one ever dreamt in Washington. That's the important part. So they were behind pumping these people up in certain countries, not all the countries. I know the discussions were taking place in the State Department about post-Mubarak, what should happen. But they were taken off guard when the events unfolded in Tunisia and spread to Egypt. And believe me, it's not going to stop in Egypt. What's happening in Egypt today is rising of general population, rich and poor, professionals and factory workers, old and young, Muslim and Christians, joining hands. The only thing that brought them together is enough of this oppression of Mubarak regime. So this particular anger and revolt started off with the spark. The spark was the killing in Alexandria of a young man. And the new technology, as you are aware, that is the one that brought it to the general public. And here we are seeing a mass movement which will not go backwards. If not, there is a possibility it could go backwards if there is a bloodshed. So the crisis is there because of human rights abuses and economic disparity. The opportunity that's going to come to promote and protect human rights will depend on how this crisis is going to end. Today there are rumors, news items that President Mubarak may step down. That's a symbolic victory. But that could be also a curse for the movement. People may think we have won the game, let's go home. The military and the police may say, okay, you asked for his removal, he's gone, go home. And who is going to replace will determine. What's going to happen after Mubarak steps down will determine whether this is an opportunity to improve human rights in Egypt and other places. The issue is whether people in the square and around the world, and most importantly, US administration, wanted to push for a meaningful and important changes, structural changes. Changing an individual or changing an individual with a group of people who have the same mindset and the mechanism in place will not help. The way that it will help is take this as an opportunity to immediately put in place the structural changes. The immediate ones are there, obviously. Removal of the emergency declaration, release of political prisoners. Because under these emergency laws, all these abuses were happening. Now the military is playing good cop game, very good. But they were part of it at one point. But fortunately, they took the side of the people on the streets. So now, after Mubarak leaves, it could be today, it could be tomorrow. The question is, what type of group that's going to be there until a free and fair election is held there? That is the key. If the current Vice President Sulaiman is going to be there, that's a very bad news. Because now half the people say, okay, Mubarak is gone, let's work with this guy. That's a very bad news. As mentioned earlier, he was an intelligence chief. What do you expect from an intelligence chief? Torture, disappearance. He is famous for that. So he will try to put in practice what he is used to know. What about removing him and bring some other military force or supporters of Mubarak? That is even bad news, because there won't be anything we can talk about those people. So the challenge today at this critical time to make this crisis as an opportunity is to see what can be done to have the right set of people who are there in the transition until the election itself. That's where Egyptians, people on the ground, should have solid proposals to say these are the people who should be there. Believe me, these people, some of these people could be bought over. We don't know these people. They are just coming out of woodworks. They are good people, but they are not experienced in wheeling and dealing. So it's not, opportunities are there, it's not there yet. That's why people around the world, especially people in the US, not only the administration but people here, policymakers, should be vigilant to ensure that not only the institutions are put in place, judiciary for example, it's been controlled by the government all these years. Checks and balances. What type of checks and balances you are having to avoid one person or one party taking advantage of the crisis situation? Those institutions should be set in place by the new constitution or amendment to the current constitution. So the test today is, what are the recommendations that are going to be proposed immediately to ensure that immediately they remove all these bad laws and release these people and hold people who killed 300 odd people to justice. By the way, there are people who disappeared. We don't know how many people have gone missing. What type of structural changes we are going to have, especially in the Constitution, about the Parliament, who runs the election, all these structural changes have to be there. That's when we can claim that this crisis has become an opportunity for people of Egypt as well as people around the world who are oppressed and people who are living like that. So to do that, we need pressure from outside and inside. To do that, we need not to remove the attention from Egypt, at least for some time. Then when the institutions are held in place, then the biggest test comes, the elections. It could be November, it could be December, we don't know, because as of now it's November. The test is make sure it's free and fair elections. People should own it. They should own it to feel that yes, whoever who was elected reflects the will of the people. If that happens, then we can proudly say that 30 years of suffering the people of Egypt have undergone, the 30 years of brutality they faced is worth the price, because at least for their future generation, they have opened the door for a successful life. One danger of democracy is the minorities. So again, when you give democracy, make sure there are strong provisions in the Constitution that protect minorities there. You know, there is Coptic Christians there, about 10%. Everything is fine today. They are all in the square waving. When election comes, the majority wins. To whip up the majority support, you never know who will use whatever language and get elected. The fear that we have is, of course, the Constitution. But the immediate fear we have is using terror as an excuse to silence and to deviate meaningful improvement in Egypt. They have this Muslim Brotherhood. You name it. I mean, if you go to Congress, you know how many people are worried. Oh my God, these guys are going to run over Egypt. That's where the problem comes. In Latin America, they had the communists at one point, when all these one-party states were there. Where are the communists now? Russia is gone, but where are the communists gone? When you give people power, people will select and elect the people who are moderate, who are the people. Because people in general around the world are very compassionate with each other. Only minorities in any country are extremists. So another trap we have to watch out now is to ensure that this terrorism red flag is not going to sideline and to hijack this people movement. That is very dangerous, because people can get taken over by that. So if we can bypass all these challenges and the Constitution is drafted or amendments can be improved and an election is held with real protection to the minorities, it's not only victory to the people of Egypt, it is a victory to people around the world. Thank you very much.
So we can open it up for a bit of discussion, again, as we're waiting for Joe to come onto the telephone, but a few thoughts, moderator's prerogative, I guess. You know, there's certainly a crisis. There are certainly many opportunities, but we're not starting from a blank slate. And so as we talk about the need to reform the Constitution, to create an actual independent judiciary, a system of checks and balances, to respect freedom of expression and assembly and basic fundamental human rights, to overcome 30 years of oppression and to create a culture that would enable free and fair elections to actually take place in the span of 6 months, it's a big mandate, and it's a big opportunity, but it's also a big challenge. And given the fact that, as I think we've noted already, while change is happening at this moment, it is not clear what tonight or tomorrow morning's regime is going to look like, and if it is really as different as the people may think or expect. So I guess I have two questions. One is in terms of the role of the Army, because I think both of you have noted that the Army has played a very interesting, very delicate, very, I guess interesting would be the most non-committal word that I could come up with, role in terms of creating that space, as Jack mentioned, for the protests to take place, not participating in crackdowns, and yet Suleiman last night said they're open to that. And certainly comments of this morning alluded to the fact that it was possible, if not likely, that could happen in coming hours or days. So the role of the Army in transition, I think, is a really important one to take a look at. The other one is, again, as Jack sort of mentioned, in these moments of transition, there are a lot of missteps that can happen. And as we move forward and look at kind of the accomplishments of transition as well as failed attempts at transition, like Tiananmen, what do we take from this moment, and how do we create this crisis into a real opportunity and with real change and facts on the ground, from a human rights perspective?
Sure.
I'll let Jack go first.
Very important questions about where we stand today going forward, and I'll respond to both of them. We're really talking about the what may happen from the perspective of the Egyptian army, and then what might the movement, if we can indeed call it a movement, what might the movement do to enhance the chance that this will be a successful transition to democracy, assuming there is a change in Mubarak's status and a change of power, an exchange of power between certain members of what I've been calling the residual regime. I think, let me restate something that I said when I spoke several minutes ago. The sense that change is imminent is within the spirit of those participating in this movement, and increasingly among many ordinary Egyptians. I think the army recognizes that because they see their historical role as potentially in jeopardy if they are seen denying the wishes of the Egyptian people. So that expectation that there is going to be substantial change must be rewarded, or be seen to be rewarded in some way, and I think that realization is in the minds of those parts of the residual regime which want to survive the transition. There are many individuals representing many material interests who have participated in this former regime, and whether in the future there is any truth and reconciliation process in Egypt or some equivalent thereof, we don't know. But they're very interested in personal survival. And so those individuals will be making decisions about how their role will be seen in retrospect right now. That is something that has not been noticed too much by the news media, but that is operating. Another constraint on the Egyptian military is U.S. military assistance, which was explicitly threatened. The cutoff of that was explicitly threatened by the White House a week ago Friday, re-threatened last week, and re-threatened again earlier this week, 3 separate times. The Egyptian military has gotten that message. That's a substantial amount of money. It pays for salaries, it pays for vacations, it pays for participation in, command and staff colleges. There are a lot of wonderful benefits that senior members of the Egyptian military get out of that. We often don't notice the things that operate on people personally, and the fact that a number of people's careers are at stake. That should not be regarded as an idle threat. That threat has been made in a discreet way. It hasn't been broadly noticed in the media, and I frankly think that that's probably deliberate, so as not to place people who are expected to make a favorable decision about retaining civic space in an embarrassing position, particularly. So that's something to bear in mind as we look at the immediate events of the next several days. What can the movement itself, what can ordinary Egyptians do to influence this process of transition? That vitally has to do with their ability to say, yes, we will demobilize, or we won't do a demonstration next Tuesday or next Friday in Tahrir Square. I think, from what I've been able to detect, that activists who are in a position to spark organization or remobilization recognize they can't totally give up possession of Tahrir Square. It has come to represent something profoundly psychological to the movement, the Egyptian people, and the outside world. So it's very unlikely that there would be total demobilization from that square. There might be substantial demobilization if, and this is the condition that they seem to be setting, the individuals and the ground rules for an initial interim transition, whether that's a council or a roundtable or a negotiation process, the participants in that will be closely observed and watched. One of the reasons that transitions have broken down in the past is that the democratic forces represented by a movement in place or a movement that has begun to participate in that transition doesn't recognize an opportunity to expand its base, even with concessions at the outset that don't appear to be proportionate to the emotion that the movement feels about propelling change. Most of the successful transitions have been managed on both sides because an initial round of concessions from a regime were taken by the movement, and those concessions permitted a somewhat wider space for the movement to survive and to continue to grow. That's as important. That's even more important if you look at the historical examples than something that seems proportionate right away, instantaneously, to the initial demands of the movement. We'll see if this movement, we'll see if its leaders recognize that. I don't know that they don't recognize that. So there is some hope in this process. The other thing, though, that's critical that a movement must do is retain its capacity to apply pressure and keep pressure on, especially in the economic dimension that affects every single person in the residual regime who wants to survive the complete transition. They have material interests. They are vulnerable. That vulnerability must be kept in view by this movement, and they need to think about tactics other than protest to be able to sustain that pressure all the way through the transition. When there was an extended transition in South Africa, the movement in place did not neglect its understanding of those opportunities to reapply pressure, to remobilize, should that be necessary.
Sorry for the distraction. We're just dialing into Joe Stork. Do you want to say anything? No, why don't you, because it's going to take us a moment to get through to him. Or maybe not.
I ignored it.
Right, exactly. We're, one moment and we're patching him in.
Hello?
Joe. Hi, Joe.
Yes, hello.
Joe, hi, it's Hadar. How are you? We actually have
Hi.
we have you live on the air because we have no other way to do this. You're either all in or you're all out. So
Great, okay.
you are currently
Great.
talking. We welcome you and thank you for making all efforts to be with us today. We have a room filled with people. We have quite a few people watching on webcast, and so I sent you a quick email kind of briefing you on where we are in our conversation, but we are looking forward to hearing from you on the ground, your perspective of having been in Cairo over the last few weeks and currently there now. I feel like a news reporter. What can you tell us, Joe?
Well, I think one thing, given the focus of your meeting, that I should underscore here, if it isn't obvious already, is the extent to which human rights issues really underlie this rather momentous uprising we've seen over the last 2.5 weeks. This started with a very, very large demonstration on January 25th, a Tuesday. It was a holiday, and ironically, it was National Police Day. And the protest was called that day very much in the name of Khalid Saeed, the young 28-year-old Alexandrian who was brutally murdered on the street last June by 2 undercover policemen. And the Facebook group in particular that called itself We Are All Khalid Saeed, this was really it wasn't the only piece of the action, but it was definitely kind of no other element was more important than this one. So I think that's really important to stress. The other thing I'd note is that, with the exception of the Wednesday and Thursday, February 2nd and 3rd last week, when pro-Mubarak gangs armed with sticks and knives and other things attacked the pro-democracy protesters. Except for that, things have been, particularly amongst the huge numbers, hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets, either marching or assembling at Tahrir Square. An incredibly good spirit, very strong camaraderie, a great, what shall I say, sort of civic-mindedness. I'm not sure that's quite a big word, but I don't know how else to describe it. Let me just make one more point, given today's developments, or at least where they seem to be moving in terms of Mubarak stepping aside in one way or another. Is that I think we have to keep our eye not on the personalities, even the top personalities like Mubarak, but we have to keep our eye on the institutions, and we have to keep our eye on structural changes or the absence of structural changes. And frankly, that's what I'm most concerned about now, is that we are going to see a change in personnel perhaps at the very top, but if we don't have an end to emergency law, if we don't have, a very clear stand taken from the very top against torture, if we don't see the kinds of reforms in the political parties of law that would allow for, real meaningful freedom of association, then, there's a lot more struggle ahead.
Right. Thanks, Joe. I think at this point maybe we can open up to questions, because we do have many people here who I want to give an opportunity to ask questions. Questions from the floor? Jared,
My
you'll
question.
have to speak very loudly, please.
My question would be, why now?
The question is, why now?
Human rights situation in Egypt has always been very bad. The economic conditions have been
The
tough.
situation has always been bad. The economic conditions have always been tough.
Why is Tahrir Square not Tiananmen Square?
Why is Tahrir Square not Tiananmen Square? Joe, you want to start with that?
Are you asking me to start?
Sure.
Well, I'm not sure what I can say. I mean, why now? A perfectly very good question, and that's going to take a little while to think about. I really think, going back to the point I made earlier, it really seems like the murder, the police murder of this young guy, Khalid Saeed, really changed things fundamentally. And he was a very ordinary guy. I mean, he wasn't a political activist in the least. He could have been anyone's son, anyone's brother, anyone's husband, and he was just brutally murdered in public by undercover policemen. And additionally, the state basically covered it up for him. They said they completely lied about how he died. They completely denied what was evident in the photos of his battered face that went around on YouTube and on the other social networking sites. So that kind of outrage, which comes after over the last several years, other instances of phone videos of people being tortured in police stations and this kind of thing. There was just a sense that, I think a tipping point was reached. And it took a while to build. After all, that murder happened back in June. Here we are a bit more than 7 months later. But we saw something take off in January, these last 2.5 weeks of January, February, that became pretty unstoppable. And why is it not Tiananmen? Well, for a little bit last Wednesday, Thursday, I wouldn't say it looked like Tiananmen at all, but it certainly looked like, kind of a fascist counteroffensive. The kind of, all that was missing were the brown shirts in terms of the attacks that happened I was down in Tahrir Square on that Wednesday afternoon when the attack started. And I was trying to get around downtown the next day as well. It was extremely hostile atmosphere towards, as you know, towards journalists, towards people like myself who were, trying to document what was going on. So it wasn't Tiananmen. The tanks were not rolling, and the army had made pretty clear once they took over the streets on January 28th that they would not be, they had no intention of using the tanks or their weapons generally against the protesters. But they played, the army has played a very ambiguous role here, I think. For one thing, they played a different role at different places at different times. On that Wednesday, Thursday, they basically stood back, were very passive, let the attacks take place against the pro-democracy protesters. And those attacks followed immediately on President Mubarak's speech of last Tuesday night, where he basically said, he wasn't going to resign, and he wasn't going to leave Egypt, and the real Egyptians would stand up, and this kind of language. The army basically stood back and let that happen. And I think another interesting point here is the role of outside powers, including the United States. Because I think they did, the Obama administration and various, certainly European, that sent a very strong message after those Wednesday, Thursday attacks that this had to stop, and that military aid and other forms of support for the government and the military in particular was very much at stake. And those attacks did stop. I mean, they stopped on a dime. It was like a light switch going on and off. What we've seen, we also saw beginning on into last Thursday, in some places the army seemed to be playing actually a protective role towards the protesters. That is, providing smoke screens that would to push back the pro-Mubarak gangs from attacking in some places, particularly once firearms came out. And more recently, as we documented just in the last couple of days, we also saw army officers, stationed on the street, picking up protesters, picking up people who were trying to bring blankets and other supplies into Tahrir Square, detaining them for hours or in some cases for a couple of days, and in a few cases that we documented, badly beating and torturing people. So, the army, I don't think we want to talk about, a shifting pattern or a trajectory here, but we saw different behavior by different units at different times. And, I think particularly, maybe just one last point on this, what we've seen just in the last couple of days, yesterday and today, with pretty significant strikes going on, in various workplaces, including the railroads, including the spinning factories out in Mahala, and the steel plants in Helwan and so forth, over primarily economic demands, but also supporting the political demands. I could imagine that if this goes on over the coming weeks, we could see confrontations between whoever is assuming policing powers, whether it remains the army or whether they bring back in basically, the Ministry of Interior.
Thanks, Joe. I think that really underscores so much of what Jack painted from the beginning in terms of how often these kinds of movements go on and emerge at those kinds of moments where there is a tipping point and yet groundworks have been laid. I want to provide an opportunity for people to ask their questions. Shubhra?
Yeah. I guess this is addressed to anyone.
Loudly.
This could be addressed to anyone who wants to answer this. But aside from the last week, I think everyone understands that the U.S. has been really complicit in Mubarak and his regime's ability to maintain strong police control over society. The U.S. government has called Egypt a democracy despite all the elections being rigged, and despite the fact that the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood has been banned from elections, etc. All these disappearances by human rights activists, political activists, murders have happened under the U.S.'s gazes. And I was wondering, aside from the last week where under a lot of protest the U.S. government issued some pretty compelling statements, how should our policies change in any way, or that could strategically change, with our interest still in mind, that would not allow that to happen again, to not allow whatever government comes into control to exercise such violent repression over society?
So, Joe, just to repeat the question, and for those of you watching on webcast, the question basically was, the U.S. over 30 years has been fairly complicit in Mubarak, the Mubarak regime's treatment of the people, its violation of human rights norms, I'm paraphrasing, and the question arises, how is that going to change now, or will it change now? What does the U.S. have to do, despite the fact that the Obama administration has come out over the last few days and did give very specific warnings around the potential cutting of military aid? How does that change, or does that stay the same? And how can it be used for a carrot rather than a stick? Would that be a good rephrasing? It's a little changing it, but Kumar, do you want to let Joe take it? Joe, you're in demand.
Well, I think again I would put the emphasis on the need to look at the institutions, the need to look at the structures of oppression, and to make sure that those are changed. And I think that's going to. I think the U.S. obviously has a big role to play in that. I think in the absence of a lifting of the emergency law. I think as the White House put it, the aid posture should still be very much on the table. I think there should be, benchmarks laid out for the new authorities, whoever they are, to take what are, very important and measurable steps. I think there are. And keep in mind, at least as far as I know, unless it's happened since I got on the phone with you, we still don't know exactly how this is going to play out, even tonight. So just bear that in mind. But there are, according to Egypt's constitution, certain steps that only the president can take, one of those would be the revocation of the emergency law. There are things that Mubarak really should do before he completely steps out of the picture in terms of allowing for a change in a democratic direction. The people like Omar Suleiman could perhaps play a transitional role if that period of transition is quite short. Other people who, according to the Constitution, are in line for succession. I'm thinking here of Fatih Sarur, the Speaker of the People's Assembly, would frankly be a disaster. So that there is so much at play, and the situation is so fluid that I think it is really important for us to, I'm thinking now as if I was with you in Washington, but to, be keeping up the pressure on the administration to, set those benchmarks in terms of institutional and structural changes and not just changes in personalities.
Great, thank you. Jack Duvall.
Just wanted to add a postscript to that good answer from Joe to your question. When you think about the United States government, it's best not to think about it as a monolithic entity. There are different interests, global interests, as well as policy interests represented by different moving parts of the administration. And as is generally well known, with respect to certain regimes or governments, which is to say states, that have historically been recognized to be sitting astride locations that have strategic interest to the United States, the account of maintaining relationships may not necessarily be with the State Department. So, however, once there is a global appreciation of substantial human rights abuses that have been committed by agencies of a government that is supported by the United States, perhaps even with physical materials that have been provided by through United States assistance, this then becomes an opportunity for the international human rights community to be able to focus like a laser on those relationships, call those into question, and particularly with respect to this region and the general sense in the region that now may be an opportunity for action in the streets, to be able to lift to higher visibility the nature of those relationships. You have influence. Every single one of us in this room has influence. Every single human rights organization, particularly Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have enormous influence with respect to giving more visibility. And events give us a stage on which to be able to propel this visibility. That directly affects not just whoever's holding the account with respect to a bilateral relationship between the United States and another country, but everybody within, particularly the White House, which there happens to be a president of the United States right now who has some historical knowledge of the importance of nonviolent protest in winning people's rights. So that probably is why he keeps emphasizing agency as opposed to structure and protecting, space for agency in his own remarks. That's something to use, How can you say that and yet look at this relationship over here? So that would be my appeal to everyone here.
Other questions, comments, thoughts? Yes, ma'am. Loudly, please.
I have a comment, though it's not really concerning about Egypt. It looks like the world is just keeping quiet about dictators developing. For instance, I come from Uganda, and the constitution was changed and the presidential term limits were removed.
I didn't barely hear you, sorry.
Okay, I come from Uganda where presidential term limits were removed from the constitution. So now President Museveni can be there until probably his deathbed. This is breeding a lot of dictatorship, and I'm sure at one time the Ugandans may be quiet today because we are having those, cosmetic elections. But I think people are getting tired of this kind of behavior, and it looks like that is a whole thing in most of the Arab League, where you can have Gaddafi who has been there for over 40 years and all that.
So is there a question or frustration?
It's frustration.
Frustration. So the speaker is from Uganda, and she is expressing her frustration around the fact that dictators are not only in Egypt and not only in Tunisia, but that with the removal from the constitution of presidential term limits in Uganda, she's concerned that there's a certain acceptance of what's going on in her country, and that the international community is not stepping in to do anything or just support reform, and is instead praising what she said were cosmetic elections that are scheduled to take place. Yeah? Was that a good resumming of your statement? So, a point taken. Anybody want to respond say anything? Other questions?
This is for any of the panelists. I'm interested to know what the panelists think the April 6th youth or the We Are All Khaled Said group did right in terms of recruiting a broad swath of support from many different sectors of Egyptian society, and how they can use those techniques in the coming months to effect the structural changes that we're hearing recommended today.
The question was, how do any of you believe the April 6th movement, what did they do right to recruit the broad swath of people who are currently involved in this movement, and how can they use those techniques to affect structural change that everyone has called for on this panel in the coming months? Right?
No one else?
Joe, do you want to start?
Well, I think, I wouldn't single out the April 6th movement here. The April 6th movement was one of several movements, if you will, networks built up among mainly young people, technically savvy people savvy using social networking and so forth. I think to go back a little bit further in recent history, the kind of demonstrations that we saw back in 2002 in solidarity with the Palestinians, in 2003 protests against the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. These were extremely important in terms of really setting a new tone, even if they were, put down rather brutally. We saw it also then with the emergence of the Kifaya movement, Kifaya meaning enough, and taking and a little bit of space that was created here in Egypt around the 2005 parliamentary and presidential elections. So, April 6th came after that. April 6th built on that, and then, as I mentioned in my first remarks, I think the role of the We Are All Khaled Said Facebook group really was kind of, if there was any one kind of catalyzing element here, that was it. But there's an awful lot of overlap, of course, between these different groups, overlapping in terms of personalities, overlapping in terms of techniques, and even generations, which is another point worth making, I think, is that while certainly this movement out on these hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets have been, largely young adults, it's been people of all generations. Increasingly here in Cairo, as the protests went on, people of different classes, economic classes. I think it's worth noting that the kind of really quite articulate expressions of Muslim-Christian solidarity were very important in all of this. The fact that, for instance, over the many days where the security forces had disappeared, and there were really no police forces out except basically neighborhood committees that got set up to guard particular streets and particular apartment buildings. None of the no Christian churches or Jewish synagogues. There wasn't the least bit of graffiti, never mind any more kind of serious attacks on those institutions. So, I think what we've seen here is really, it's really quite exhilarating, actually. Of course, there's no guarantee that this will continue, but that is the spirit that's been behind what we've seen over the last 2.5 weeks.
Let me just add a thought to that. This is Jack Duvall again. Joe, you put your finger on the catalyst event, which was the Khaled Said video. It's my observation that the specific activists associated with April 6th, Kifaya and some of the other groups that you mentioned, were very aware that in the aftermath of that, they had an opportunity to do additional organizing. By the way, most of these activists have done a lot of learning about strategic nonviolent action in the last several years, so they're not without some ability to navigate this landscape in a deliberate fashion. The events in Tunisia, however, added a psychological element to the opportunity that they saw, because they asked themselves the question, how can we not attempt something at this point in light of what happened in Tunisia? The Tunisians have now taken ownership. The Tunisian people have taken ownership of the process of change in that country. Surely, as Egyptians, we can do at least as well as this, if not better, regardless of the circumstances we face. But not only is that a sense of pride, it's a sense of the existential moment, that people who have a knowledge about what to do and how to attempt to organize, in this case, how to convene a general protest, that existential moment hasn't shifted or gone down. If anything, and it's been amplified by these events. And in the actions that those who comprise this present movement, which I think we should call it that, a more coherent movement than existed just weeks ago, in the actions going forward, they'll see opportunities to continue to apply pressure. How do you apply, can you answer your question, how do you apply pressure to structures which may contain elements of a residual regime? You try to change the circumstances in the political and indeed in the economic environment in which those structures exist by putting in jeopardy, if necessary, their interests. And you can do that if you have a sufficient number of people mobilized to take a sufficiently diverse number of actions, including strikes and boycotts, and specific decentralized and dispersed actions, which put pressure on the interests of people who have to make decisions, who are part of the residual regime, about whether to give further ground, about whether to make honest and authentic a democratic transition process.
Question over here.
Yeah, I'm just curious about the panelists' reaction to how these populist movements interact with the rule of law, or the strengthening of rule of law institutions. Because it seems to me that there could be a double-edged argument on both sides that these are needed to establish more appropriate rule of law, actual rule of law, and at the same time they might in a way subvert more legitimate governments. Maybe it's not a good example in Egypt, but isn't there the possibility that maybe populist movements have a way of harming rule of law institutions?
So the question was how the interplay between populist movements and the establishment of rule of law. And isn't there the possibility that popular movements or populist movements like this could undermine or subvert more legitimate regimes as opposed to subverting just oppressive ones? That sort of?
Yeah, just reactions on that.
Okay, reactions on that. I think no reaction on that one.
I've spoken too much.
Okay. Joe, do you want to, you're sitting there in the middle of things and your mandate is through the entire region. How do you look at that or respond to that?
Well, I think it's a very good point, and it's really difficult to answer right now. I mean, it would, first of all, we take someone more familiar than I am, frankly, with the dynamics of the different groups and different people and different kind of trajectories that are represented in Tahrir and more broadly in the opposition movement in Egypt. But I think that, I mean, we've seen it. Jack made a very good point to remind us that Tunisia came first here, and we've seen some of that play out in Tunisia too, and with violence on the streets, with some in the recent days some shooting deaths and so on. But I think exactly getting a kind of the demand that Mubarak must go, and which was the one kind of unifying demand out there. Once that's satisfied, if you will, and my concern is that when the army spokesman this afternoon said the army will meet all your legitimate demands, and of course legitimate, who defines what's legitimate? that's going to be very much in play over the coming weeks, months, if not years.
So let me ask you one question that's on my mind, and I think a lot of other people's minds. What's next? Who's next? Where's next? We see Tunisia, we see Egypt, we see protests that have emerged in a lot of different countries, and some space that's being allowed for those protests to occur, and space that is not being allowed. I guess that's not the right way to put it, but protests that are not being allowed to take place in other parts of this region. Can we use a crystal ball and kind of look ahead at where some of the other regimes are today? Joe, you want to go first?
Well, one would look, I think, to places where, again, there have been sort of groups out on the street, prior to the last month or so. Obviously, Yemen is one place where I'd say the situation is pretty dire in terms of the economic situation there, and as a result of that, in part, the political, a very high level of political instability. But there's all kinds of other things going on in Yemen that were not going on in Egypt or Tunisia. Jordan, we've seen in recent days the interesting phenomenon, apparently, of tribal voices, or voices associated with very traditional East Bank Jordanian elements, also making demands on King Abdullah in terms of political process, political structures, and so forth. I don't quite see anything like what's happened in Tunisia and Egypt happening in Jordan, but I think that we could well see some changes of a, shall we say, less drastic nature. I think, Bahrain is a place to keep an eye on, where again you have a pretty well-developed protest movement, some very serious grievances, communal polarization between Sunnis and Shiites. I don't know. I don't like looking at crystal balls anyway, but that's just a couple of comments.
Great, thanks. Jack?
Yeah, just a comment on Syria. Let's also keep our eye on Syria, which just made Facebook available to Syrians this last week. That's what I call an example of prophylactic reformism, which is to say, to try to prevent happening here what happened somewhere else, we'll be nice guys. You can have Facebook. Do updates about your favorite rock group, please, on Facebook. Become completely addicted to that. No, I'm joking. But in fact, that's important. It is a tool. It is a tool that many Syrians will find useful. The other thing about Syria, of course, historically, is that Damascus was always seen as a center for Arab intellectual activity. And this Damascus Cafe Society always contributed something to the intellectual life of the Arab world. And I think that there is a view on the part of many Syrians that they should have a say in what is happening in the Arab world. And if the Arab world seems to be moving in one direction, then they should at least be able to have a say about that. They should be able to express themselves. And I do think that the right of self-expression is absolutely central to examining what happens going forward with respect. I'll tell you one little anecdote about Syria that a Syrian dissident told me a couple of years ago. He had got it in his mind to run for parliament. There's nothing in the Syrian constitution which prevents independent candidates from running for parliament. You don't have to be a member of the ruling party. So he had a famous surname, even though he wasn't related to anybody. And so he ran for parliament, and he was a fabulous campaigner, and he was running all around his district, meeting people, and people were just stunned that he was doing this, and he was gathering popularity. And then, of course, one night he gets the call from someone associated with the security services, and they say, but here's what the caller said. He said, the president has really admired your spirit on the campaign trail. He really likes what he thinks you really have promise, as a political actor in this country. He just, but you've become way too popular. So of course we're not going to be able to put your name on the ballot. he said, so why can't you find some other outlet for this tremendous energy? He really does like you. And the dissident read that as the desire of the president to be well-liked, and also paying close attention to people who seem to be getting popular traction, just to say that's something you can work with if you're trying to start something in a society. So I wouldn't exclude, largely for historical reasons, I would not exclude, and this one sign of allowing Facebook. It could not have been lost on anyone that Facebook was a major tool of organizers in Egypt. So.
The events in Egypt, started in Tunisia obviously, is going to have impacts in the region. That's a given. That doesn't mean regimes are going to change, but people will open up. You are seeing movements in that direction. The one challenge that we all should be watching out is the Palestinian issue, how the Palestinians will interpret the uprising there, and how it will have impact in West Bank and Gaza. Gaza, of course, they will feel that people have come out, so they will get a positive signal. West Bank citizens also may take a different take on it. So watch out for that particular issue is the one that I'll be watching out. One question you asked about how to transform the current groups that came about April 6th and others into future progress. Is that there is promise. I have been watching this for the last 2-3 weeks. It initially it's like everyone got together. Now they are moving in the right direction. Hopefully they will also transform themselves by electing the right representatives, not selecting whatever the form they can, to make them master voice of the people who are there in that square, as well as for the Egyptian people to talk about transition.
We're coming to the end of our time. Obviously, Facebook has been mentioned. Nobody has said Twitter, which is kind of amazing to me, or Google, or the Google and Twitter connections that were made a couple of weeks ago to enable people who did not have internet connection to actually still be able to SMS messages throughout. The role that technology has played in this entire region and continues to play is the topic probably for another panel, but is one that I think is fascinating and continues to emerge. Also, the fact that China has banned the word Egypt or Egypt protests from their search engines as a result of everything that has gone on, I think is another piece that needs to be noted and needs to be discussed as well. Because as we're talking about Jordan and Syria and the Palestinian territories, we're also looking at China, we're also looking at Uganda, we're looking at other parts of the world who are looking closely at what is going on in this region. I want to leave it for final words from our panelists. If you have anything else to kind of add to this discussion, because I do want to stay mindful of our time. Joe, again from the ground, or from whatever floor you are in your hotel, do you want to make any kind of closing comments?
That's a difficult assignment there, Hadar. Again, I guess rather trite to say, but I think the hard work is just beginning. This has been an exhilarating couple of weeks here for Egyptians first and foremost, and for the people who worked so hard over the years, to trying to catalyze this change. The people in the human rights community here, the political activists whose space for maneuver was extremely limited. I think now that there's one achievement, and we don't even know actually as we speak now exactly what the scope of that achievement is. We do know that Egypt's not going to be the same again next week or next month as it was back at the very beginning of this year. But exactly sort of what kinds of changes are instituted tonight or in the coming days, and sort of what kind of programs are going to be possible. I think the struggle goes on.
Thank you. Joe. Jack, final comments? Kumar?
Yeah, the coming days and weeks will determine where this crisis, as well as all these mass participation of the people, is going to be making any changes. That's a challenge. It's two-pronged. One is the people on the ground in Egypt, whether they are going to have a victory parade and go home after, majority go home after Mubarak, if he leaves, then that's a bad news. They should keep up the pressure. They should really continue this until institutions have been placed. At least correct people have been elected to do that process. The second players are here in Washington. What role Washington is going to play in terms of pushing this agenda through. That's where everyone here in this town is extremely important, to be vigilant and to make sure that the victory is not half-baked, victory is not temporary, it becomes permanent.
Well, thank you to all of you who participated in the room, all of you who are watching on webcast. And Joe, we wish you safe travels and to stay safe and continue to do the important work that you and Jack and Kumar are doing, along with activists around the world. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.